Okay, so good morning everybody and welcome to the Dairy Research Webinars series that we're just starting today. It's going to be the first of a number of talks over the next couple of months, one a month for the next up to November, looking at different research topics that have been covered in various research centres across the country, just to give people information into the background behind the research and maybe some of the identify some of the research that's underpinning some of the advice that we're now giving as a result of the practices that have been learned from the research. So today we have James Humphreys and Frederica Fenga are going to talk about the most profitable stocking rate on a fragmented farm, or the most appropriate stocking rate on a fragmented farm. And I suppose it's appropriate in that given the spring that we've had, and so far in some cases the summer that we've had, where pressure has come on as a result of maybe higher stocking rates as well. So it's appropriate to look at that, and it's a question that we're very regularly asked is what's the appropriate stocking rate. So James has looked at a number of scenarios, and his presentation of about 23 or 24 slides that he's going to go through. We can take questions and answers, or questions on the Q&A as we go along, and if the question is relevant at the time of during the presentation, we may put it to James at that stage, or we might hold them till the end. We'll see as we go along. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, so James, and let you start your presentation.
Good morning, Stuart. Thanks, Stuart, and good morning, everybody. As Stuart said, I'm going to, myself and Frederica, we're going to talk about the optimum stocking rate and the grazing platform of a fragmented farm, and this is work in collaboration with WIT. The background to this study: Irish farms are fragmented into 3.5 parcels on average per farm. When you look at the grazing platform component of that, around 56% of the total farm area is in the grazing platform of tip co-op suppliers, which is of particular relevance to us in Silage, and across the country as a whole, around 60% of the total farm area is on the grazing platform. So the objectives are we wanted to examine what was the optimum stocking rate on the milking platform of a fragmented dairy farm. So ultimately it comes down to the economics. Of course, that will depend on the milk output per cow, milk sales, and then harvest production, feed budgets, and feed costs. So we'll go through all that to put ourselves in the frame of mind how we started to think about this. Silage is 50 hectares, so we took a farm area of 50 hectares, 125 cows, and the same cubicles and slurry storage for 125 cows, or at least this was our starting point. And same replacement rate, they're all contract reared. And then the target was to produce 60 tons of milk solids, or 1,200 kilos of milk solids off the platform, and farms are fragmented into different extents. Or off the entire farm. We want to produce 60 tons off the entire farm. Farms then were fragmented to different extents. 100% all the farms available on the grazing platform, 82%, 72%, or 62%. You might wonder where those percentages come from. But this is the framework we're using. 4 farms, and this rectangle here represents the entire farm size. So the 4 farms are same size. They're all stocked at 2.5 livestock unit, well, cows per hectare. And then they're fragmented to different extents. So in this case, 18% of the farm is in an out block, and the remainder of the farm then is stocked at 3 cows per hectare. In this case, 28% of the farm is in the out block, some distance from the farm. It's only used for silage. There's no grazing as such takes place on the out block. 3.5 cows per hectare then on the platform, and in this case almost 40% in the out block, which works out to 4 cows per hectare on the platform. So that's where those percentages come from. But just to re-emphasize, all the farms are the same total area, just fragmented to different extents. In terms of the stocking rates then that we used, we looked at our average growth rate in terms of grass growth at Silage over. We have about almost 20 years of data. And then we set our stocking rates 2.5, kind of standard, 3, 3.5, and 4 cows per hectare here. And when we picked the 4 cows per hectare, the idea was to go above what we'd normally grow. We wanted to go too far, really, in terms of stocking rate, because you really need to go too far to test something properly in terms of your understanding. And we did want to go too far. When we look at rainfall during the study period, you see the 4 years here, or 3 years relative to the average. And I suppose what stands out is 2018, relatively dry summer. But if we take the study as a whole, the 3 years, we find that we had, and this year again, relatively dry summers overall, and wet winters. And particularly the autumn of 2017 and 19 were particularly wet. Spring of 18 was wet, following a wet autumn from 17. Spring of 19 was wet, but because of the dry summer in the preceding year, in 18, and the carryover effect over that winter didn't really have the same effect. So we had, as we'll see, a relatively long grazing season in 19, for tail seasons in 17 and 18. We look at our rainfall, annual rainfall. 18 was close to the average. The other 2 years were above average in terms of rainfall. This shows grass growth rate at soil ahead, and you might say it's very confusing, but focus on the black line. This is our average growth rate. The red line is 18, and obviously the big story in 18 is the big reduction in grass growth during the summer months, during from late June through to the end of July, effectively. Very low growth rates. The other thing is relatively low growth in the spring of 18 and 19. 17 was closer to normal. And when we look at the back end of the 3 years here, generally we good production in all years. Okay, so in the drought year 18, but there was a recovery and a relatively good back end, bearing in mind the drought conditions we had to deal with earlier in the year. When we look at the growth rates during the 3 years relative to our feed demand, you can see here at 4 cows per hectare, growth rates were up and down from that, but generally we were able to maintain grazed grass in the diet from April through till the end of September without too much difficulty. And I suppose one of the things we learned was not to react too quickly when you're stocked at 4 cows per hectare. In every year we did take silage out during the month of May, so we had a surplus during May, as you'd expect, including even 18 prior to the drought. Then when we ran through the main growing season, the best thing to do when you were operating at 4 cows per hectare was not to react. Some weeks you'd be up and you'd start running a surplus, you'd be running above target covers. Following week you might be down. And that's something we learned, just to maybe not react as quickly in terms of taking out grass from the high stocking rate as we would on the other systems. Because in the other systems, the surplus would just accumulate. With the higher stocking rate, 4 cows per hectare, the likelihood of accumulation taking place are much less likely, especially when you're running into the second half of the year. As soon as we started to run into deficits then later on in the year, we generally didn't have to feed a lot of silage during 17 and 18 during the grazing season, even at 4 cows per hectare. When we started running into the back end of the year, into the autumn, as soon as our growth rates were falling below demand, we'd start supplementing with silage. And the idea at the higher stocking rates was to stretch the length of the grazing season the same across the different systems. So at 4 cows per hectare, if growth was down, we might introduce silage for 1 day a week. And how we do that is we put the cows in for 24 hours on 1 bale of silage. 24 cows will eat that in that time period, then we'll go out hungry. And that's an idea we got from Donald Patton in that instead of supplementing the cows, say putting them in at night and out by day, or vice versa, just put them in for 1 day, eat silage for 24 hours, then back out grazing. As growth rates fell, then we'd maybe introduce 2 days a week, 3 days a week, spaced out. So the idea was to keep grass in the diet right through to the end of grazing, say right up to mid-November, and try to finish up all the systems at more or less the same pasture covered in late November. In terms of grazing days per cow, You can see our typical grazing days per cow in Silage is around 255 days. That's our benchmark, and that's measured on the basis of if a cow is out for half a day in the spring, for example, that's included as half a day. Say out by day and by night, that's included as half a day. And only the milking cows that are out are included. So dry cows are still classified as being inside and accounted as such. And on that basis, then we average typically 255 days. In this case, we had a shorter grazing season here, 2.5 cows per hectare in 17. Put that down to the wet spring and the wet autumn of 17. Dry summer in 18 obviously knocked us back. And 2019 then was closer to normal or even above normal, 260 days. It averaged out there at 240 days per cow and declined in with the higher stocking rates as you'd expect. And we're talking about for every half a cow increase in stocking rate, we were losing around 13 days per year on average. And there's a 39-day difference then between the highest and the lowest stocking rate. In terms of grass production, you can see the production of grazed grass and grass silage across the systems. No difference in grass production averaged over the 3 years. You can see differences between the years, okay. 17, 16.7, very good grass growing year. 18, back 2 tons. And then 19, 15.5 tons per hectare, tons of dry matter per hectare. You'll notice here, obviously, more grazed grass in the lower stock system and less as we go down, and that's purely a factor or a consequence of when you're restricted on the platform, obviously you can only graze what's on the platform, and the higher amount of silage here is a consequence of and that's an obvious thing to say, but it's just to point it out that we're making more silage because it's made on the outblock, it's coming in off the outblock. Just to point that out. In terms of milk production, again, the average of 3 years. You can see the data there. No difference in anything, which was a surprise. And when we look at the difference here between the control and the 4 cows per hectare, it's around 2% difference. And you can see maybe there's an upward trend here, but it doesn't make any biological sense. So we're fairly confident to say that there was no difference in milk production, around 2% difference between the control and the 4 cows per hectare, as I said. Which is a surprise, bearing in mind the fact that there was 39 days of difference in grazing days per cow. And I suppose in earlier previous studies where silage is being included in the diet, get a reduction in milk production. That's partly kind of what we expected. I suppose in this particular study, we targeted making high quality silage for feeding during lactation, and I'll say more about that. Generally, the silage that we were feeding was in the low 70s in terms of DMD, very high dry matter. We built the silage across the board, and we had conditions for it throughout the study. We also made dry cow silage then that was fed during the dry period with these DMDs in the mid-60s. But we had high quality silage going in, high DMD, relatively high DMD, high dry matter. And the cows tended to respond well to it, say when we particularly see the autumn of 17, very wet conditions. When cows were in on silage, they seem to perform very well compared to the cows that are outdoors under more difficult conditions. When we look at the silage fed per cow, this is the grazing platform stocking rate here. Typically, we'll feed around 1.4 tons of silage dry matter per cow. Close to that in 17 under control. Obviously, fed a lot more in 18 with the dry summer, the dry conditions. And less than that in 19, averaging out for around 1.5 tons of silage dry matter per cow. Multiply that by 5, around 7 tons of settled silage per cow under control, which is fairly typical. And then as we increase the stock rate, the amount of silage that we fed increased. Total increase of half a ton there, going from 1.5 up to 2 tons of silage dry matter per cow, which is an increment of around 0.16 per half cow unit. We're going by about which is a 10% increase, we say as a rule of thumb. If you want a rough rule of thumb, for every 0.5 of cow increase in stocking rate on the grazing platform, we needed an additional 10% silage. We look at the concentrates fed. Now, when we set up the study, we didn't want concentrate to become a factor in it. Often when farmers go up in stocking rate on the grazing platform, they'll feed more concentrate. We specifically didn't want to do that. We wanted to keep a low level of concentrate fed in our systems. We actually set the target much lower than what we did feed, but and the idea was to supplement with silage when we were running into a deficit, and that's really how we ran it for the most part. When we were running into deficit, we go in with silage rather than concentrate. Obviously, in 2018, we did need to go in with concentrate. We caused in silage for more or less for 2 months. We had to up the supplementation. Supplemented a bit more in the spring of 17 under the difficult conditions we were encountering at that time. And then 19 was closer to where we wanted to be, average out at around 655 kilos of concentrate per cow. And as I said, the higher feeding rate there in 17 was due to different conditions in the spring. So in terms of the economics, this is the way we set it up initially. We have our 4 grazing platform stocking rates, land area 50 hectares across the 4 systems. So this is what I talked about initially, same level of capital investment, same amount of slurry storage, same cubical spaces for 125 cows. And the only thing that's different is the degree of fragmentation. And the milk price that we use in this is the average milk price we received at Silage during the 3 years of the study, 36.7 cents per litre. So milk sales were the same because we didn't have any significant difference in milk production, so that's set the same. We look at the feed costs here. Total all sales and subsidies are also the same. We didn't include any subsidy or any BPS in this. Feed costs, then you can see increase in feed costs with the higher stocking rate, making more silage. Also the cost of that, cost of transporting slurry off the farm as a consequence of fragmentation. So that's driving up the costs, and that's reflected right through to the net margin, around 10,000 higher costs, 10,000 lower net margin, and that's reflected in the net margin per hectare. And we had figures similar to this up at the open day last year, and of course this is a bit unsatisfactory in that all of these incomes are good incomes. So you're not really learning anything from this other than all of these systems work well. So then we picked a different scenario. This is where expanding from 75 to 120 cows. We took an investment cost of €3,000 per cow. We paid that out using a Bank of Ireland loan over 7 years and using their online calculator to work out our loan repayments here. Type of scenario here that we're looking at is 50 hectare farm, 30 hectare platform. So we're talking about 60% on the platform. That would be equivalent of our higher stocking rate. At the present time, the farm is stocked at 2.5 cows per hectare on the platform. He also has the other livestock on the farm. We say beef cattle, typical situation. So it's 75 cows on the farm. What happens if he pushes up to 4 cows per hectare on the platform? Goes up to 120 cows, and the different scenarios there. So increase in milk sales in line with the cow numbers and total sales. And I suppose the big difference here is the obviously an increase in operational costs, but also an increase in the loan repayments that have to go pay for the investment. And then when we look at the impact of that on net margin, we can see, okay, so an improvement in net margin over the 7-year period. So would make sense, this milk price, to expand up to 4 cows per hectare in this situation. And of course, when you look beyond the 7 years, you can start adding back in once the loan is paid off. You'll generate a higher income, and of course, he higher net worth in terms of additional cows and the slurry storage and cubicle spaces. So at that milk price, it looks a fairly sensible thing to do. We changed the milk price, then we looked at a lower milk price, 29 cents per litre, ran the same numbers, going from 75 up to 120 cows, same level of capital investment. And in this case, we see a reduction in net margin. Initial increase, and then going down. And the same type of rationale after the 7 years. When you go into year 8, you have your no longer making loan repayments, and you're and in that case again, increase up to 4 cows per hectare to generate a higher profit after the payments were completed. So then we looked at that in a broader context, trying to. So I think the important thing here is degree of fragmentation, going from 60%, which was our highest in the study, even going beyond that to 50%. So we're talking about a 50 hectare farm here, 2 milk prices, 40 hectare platform, 35, 30, and 2.5. And I suppose the interesting thing here is these are our farm stocking rates that we studied, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4. And you can see here at the higher stocking rate, at the higher, we're a larger platform, we're actually going beyond 2.5 cows per hectare up to 2.8, 3.2, which is one type of scenario. And then when you look at the other end of the scale here, if you're very fragmented, stock to 2.5 cows per hectare on the platform, you have an overall farm stocking rate of 1.4. And then we look at our net margin here, you can see some increase initially, probably indicating that you should push up. But generally, at this end of the scale, where you're pushing up stocking rate, you're ending up buying in feed, and that can become particularly problematical at a lower milk price. As you move to the other end of the scale, it makes a lot more sense to increase, because at that end you're pushing for relatively higher output. Your stock too low. When you have a small grazing platform at these type of stocking rates, you really need to be at a higher stocking rate on the platform, and then that's more or less what it's telling us. We look at the situation, say after 9 years, in year 8, after all the loans were paid off, you can see in all cases it paid to increase on the platform, even where you're buying in feed. And when you think about that, of course, it's a high risk. You're putting yourself into a riskier situation than where you're self-sufficient in terms of feed production, and probably makes a lot of sense to stay self-sufficient in terms of home produced feed. But taking into account the costs that we used, it made sense in all cases to increase.
James, Martina Gormley here. We have a few questions coming in, James, that we might take now, if that's all right with you.
Okay.
So James, maybe if you go back, I suppose, a few slides to, and you commented there yourself where the milk solids didn't increase, where the stocking rate had gone from 2.5 to 4. So just a question coming in on that, in terms of, I suppose the comment is that the person is very surprised that milk sales hadn't increased with the extra stocking rate. So you might just go back on that, and I suppose your own thoughts on that one.
Which one is that now, Martina?
So that's yeah, the first slide there. Yeah, that one there. Yeah.
I think you have to bear in mind that the farm area and the overall stocking rate is 2.5 cows per hectare. So the farm area isn't changing. What is changing is the extent to which we have the same number of cows. So I think you have to bear in mind this is the grazing platform stocking rate. The overall farm stocking rate is 2.5 cows per hectare.
Yeah, so versus the scenario, James, of, we say, where a farmer is stocked at 3 and land comes available, we'll say down the road. Okay, this is a different scenario here.
Well, I guess if you're talking about this is what you're talking about here. 3 cows per hectare going to 4. 90 cows going up to 120. Obviously, the milk sales increase in that case, and with no change in net margin when the repayments are taken into account.
Perfect, James. Yeah, so in that scenario, you're gone from, just to be clear, 75 cows up to 120, whereas
Well, say if we're going from 3 to 4, we're going from 90 to 120.
Correct. Whereas the example prior to that was 125 cows across the board.
That's across the board. That's 4 farms, the exact same in every way except the degree to which they're fragmented.
Perfect, James.
So,
And James, just looking, I suppose, at the bottom line in terms of labour, have you additional labour costings put in for the higher stocking rate farms?
yeah. So maybe Friederike, you'd answer that one. Not there.
Yeah, sorry, just had to unmute. So in this scenario that we're looking at now, which is on the screen now, we don't have any additional labor costs because we have all the same number of cows, and we calculated labor costs on the basis of 30 hours for each cow. So in this first scenario, we don't have any additional labor costs, but then in the second scenario where we're looking at now, where we go up from 75 cows to 125 cows, then we have additional labor costs coming in.
And what labour cost have you in there?
So we calculated with 1.5 labor units of farm owned labor and everything with 30 hours for each cow, and everything which went above the 1.5 labor units, which were on the farm already, were calculated as €12 per hour.
Okay, and I think that's an important point there, because the bottom line, and I just can't see it 100% there now, but it shows an increase of, whatever, 5,000 or 6,000 euro, and people may vary on their thoughts on that, but they might say, that looks quite low, and perhaps it's not worth my time. But there is a labour cost there for additional help, and perhaps maybe every situation is different, but the farmer may want to pay for additional labour and may be quite delighted with that. And as you said, James, when the loan is repaid in a number of years' time, therefore the profit's going to go up and there's extra cows on the farm at that point in time.
Yeah, you could even argue that maybe that the labour on the farm is underemployed at the low stock rate.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so we have 2 other questions there, James, on a similar vein then. First from Michael Donoghue. Did soil fertility in terms of P&K increase on the milking platform at higher stocking rate because of more feed imported, and any implications for environmental sustainability? And it's actually the same question then from Sean McCarthy about would you care to comment on the environmental consequences of the intensification and the grazing platform? So similar to what we were discussing then before we started.
Well, I suppose, again, the overall stocking rate is the same. When you look at the outblocks and management of the outblocks, and I'll say more about that in terms of harvesting silage and bringing silage in. We changed our strategy during the study, but when you're exporting slurry off to the outblock, there's a big cost in that. And when you the kind of scenarios we're looking at here, we said the first scenario we're looking at is 2 kilometer. So the costs aren't too bad when you're looking at 2 kilometers, but the cost of exporting slurry even over that distance is substantial. When you go to longer distances, it starts to become maybe less viable. But so if you take the 2 kilometer scenario that we're kind of most familiar with, and it's probably most typically the case, putting the slurry back onto the outblock is good practice and would overcome any environmental concerns that you might have in that regard. It's also better in terms of the maintaining the fertility in the outblocks, which of course, as we've seen on farms, is a problem. I don't know if that answers the question, but when you take into account the overall farm stocking rate is the same, you're producing the same amount of total manure on the 4 systems. It's only a matter of how you manage that. I think in the duration of our study over 3 years, we didn't see any big difference in that regard. That's it, I suppose, if there's another question.
Okay, so so what you're saying, James, is I suppose maybe Michael might be wondering as well. I would nearly wonder, is it the other way that the soil fertility would go when you have a higher stocking rate or kind of higher offtake potentially off that block? And as you said, with exporting the slurry, then it actually goes back to the silage ground more often than it goes to the grazing ground.
And I'd say in practice that doesn't happen, but no, no. The risk is the build-up of fertility on the platform.
Okay. Yeah, so you can.
But when you look at our grass production, when you look at the production on the out blocks, on the home block, the levels of production were more or less the same. So, like we didn't measure nitrate leaching or anything like that. So I don't know. I think our management during the study wasn't a problem, but it could be a problem out on farms, particularly where it's the long distance between the out block and the home block.
Okay, so you've probably answered it in your comment there now, but again, Sean is just wondering about how is it perceived, we'll say, from a point of view of a carbon navigator and days of grass, concentration of urine patches and the potential for rain leaching in that, but you haven't the information on it from the study.
Well, you can look at that, and I think that's something that we're planning to look at in the future, because I think fragmentation is going to become more of an issue over time, as if we see an increase in dairy cow numbers, as we've seen, and we're likely to continue to see. I think this is something that we'll need to tackle, and we're planning to do it. We're in the process of working towards that in the next couple of years. Even the way we're running the current trial with the clover systems, where we're operating with a 3 cows per hectare on the platform, you're losing grazing days, and that has an impact, which is relatively small. It's big output is methane, and of course that doesn't change when the stocking rate doesn't change. Like, the challenge for us will be, can we run, say, 4 cows per hectare on the platform with a clover-based system? That's kind of where we'd like to go with this.
Okay, so you can carry on there, so with the presentation for now anyway.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we showed the 29 cent per litre and these different scenarios, and basically what I'm saying here is very high stocking rate, you start buying in feed, and that's a risky situation. When you're at a lower, you're very fragmented farm, and if you're a low stocking rate on the platform, in all cases, more or less it pays to increase because you're understocked and you're pushing higher output, even at a low milk price. And I suppose that's an interesting aspect to this particular part of the study. And then when you look at the overall impact in terms of, say, the long term, where you're going to be after the investments are paid off, or if you include it as net worth, you can see that more cows makes more money. I know we've had a couple of surprising results in this experiment. The first one was no difference per cow. We targeted high quality silage. It was part of our strategy, and I think that worked better than I expected. The other thing then is the proportion of silage fed during lactation. I would have had ideas in my head that maybe it was something like 25% before we started this, without having thought about it too much. And then when we look at the results of the study, we see that K18 did throw things out, but even in the other years, we're talking about, say, between 40 and 55% of the silage being fed during lactation. And averaged over the 3 years, it's between 45 and 60% was fed during lactation. And like, if you think about where we were coming from, making dry cow silage in the past, say, prior to this and an earlier study, if we went back and saw like 10 years, going for a fairly heavy first cut in late May, early June, and then a second cut sometime in July. And not being too concerned about silage quality, think this has opened our eyes to the importance of making high quality silage on the farm, and certainly I think we're going to focus more on the future. When we started out the project, we started with this scenario. We're going to take a first cut in mid-May, aiming for really high quality silage. Second cut in early July, which would have been a heavier, we say bulkier type of feed for dry cows, maybe mid-60s DMD, low to mid-60s DMD. This one, low 70s, as I said already, and then going for relatively high quality third cut. Grazing them with dry cows in November and December, and this didn't work for two reasons. The first reason is we probably weren't making enough high quality silage, bearing in mind that you can't often control the conditions you're dealing with when it comes to making silage. So, you know, you can get a string of wet weather, get a spell of wet weather, could last 2 or 3 weeks. So you might not always get the harvest when you want, and particularly in the back end of 17. Conditions got very difficult. We did harvest it in late August and 17. The other thing then that happened subsequent to this is, you know, you get a big buildup of cover on the farm between September, October. We might have had almost 3 tons per hectare of grass on the farm in October. We've no cows dried off then until say mid-November, and by the time you get the dry cows out on the, that's the protocol we were working to. By the time you get the dry cows or heifers coming back from contract rearing out onto the out block in late November, December, you've lost a lot of grass. Maybe half of the material would have just disappeared through respiration losses, going down from maybe 3 tons in October down to 1.5 tons in late November. So this kind of scenario didn't work for us. So we switched over to this. First cut mid-May, going for high quality. Second cut, again, at 6-week intervals, right through to making silage in the end of September. And this can be tricky, but we've been able to manage it. And then we brought in the zero grazer or dry cows in November, December, feeding zero graze grass into the milking cows. And we didn't have access to the zero grazer. The contractor didn't have one in the first 2 years. So 19, we were able to bring in the zero graze grass. We didn't do a lot of it, certain amount, but certainly, particularly in the very wet conditions we had at the end of 19, we found it to be a great help. Did very little damage, where there was a good run, avoiding too much turning, and worked out fine. Like you could say, is this a bit excessive going for 4-cut system, going for lighter cuts? As I said, you don't often get to decide when you make silage. If conditions are bad, you have to, ground conditions can be bad in certain circumstances, weather conditions can be bad. You might have to leave it run on for longer than you plan. So this is what I talk about here, is a kind of a plan that you should work to, aiming to make high quality silage. Try to make as much high quality silage as you can, because you'll always make bad quality silage due to circumstances outside your control. And I'm using the words good and bad very loosely here. When I talk about good, I mean in the 70s, and bad, I mean mid-60s. Like if you can't harvest silage because of weather conditions, or you harvest it under poor weather conditions, you're going to lose quality, you're going to have poor quality silage. So you'll end up with plenty dry cow silage. Another thing that we found when we look at pasture covers was, and of course this is again fairly obvious, but when you're running a high stocking rate, you're going to reach your peak cover a lot earlier. In this case, the end of August or late August in 17, which was a good back end. 19 was also a good back end. A very similar picture in 17 and 19, so I'm not going to show it, but you're peaking out around 4 weeks earlier, and you start to go into decline. And as I said, as soon as we started to go into decline with the higher stocking rate systems, we started introducing silage maybe 1-2 days a week, 3 days a week as time went on, eventually going over completely to silage. Trying to keep grass in the diet for as long as possible and to finish up with the same closing covers across all the systems. So really, from end of May, early June onwards with the 4 cows per hectare, you're better off just to let the thing run. Don't worry if the covers are getting too high, because you get a dip in growth and things will come down. You take out silage, next thing you're back in feeding silage a few weeks later. So particularly 4 cows per hectare, it's very easy to run when you take that mentality. Maybe if you're running, you're targeting a cover 170 per cow, if it runs up to 200, 220, don't worry about it because it could be back down the following week. And reacting too quickly was actually a negative, whereas at the lower stocking rates, as I said, if you start running a surplus, more than likely that's just going to snowball, so you have to take it out. It's a different mindset as you go up in stocking rate. Same type of scenario even with the drought in 18, when the growth came at the back end, again, we started to drop off much more quickly. And again, it's just an observation. So some management aspects, as I said, in terms of tying this all up, the importance of high quality silage, certainly I think much more focused on now than we were in the past. And between 40 and 45% of the silage that we made was fed during lactation. That's a very surprising figure. Even when you take 18 out of it, it's still 40 to 55%. It's still an awful lot of silage going in during lactation. And maybe we should have been more aware of this in the past. We found the four-cut system as a better approach on the outblocks, again, to make high quality silage. Zero grazing at a roll at the back end or grazing with dry cows at the end of the season. But certainly not letting yourself run into a situation where you have an awful lot of grass on the outblock in October and nothing to do with it. Better off to zero graze it. You need a clear plan for making and feeding silage, and that's why I'm talking about this four-cut system, aiming for high quality across the board, because as I said, you'll always make poor quality silage. And even when it comes to stacking silage in the yard, now this might sound a bit simple, but a few different types of silage that you need to feed at different times, it should be based on analysis. You know, make sure you're getting the high quality silage into the cows during lactation, poor quality silage during the dry period, but you also need to be able to get access to that silage and having a plan for that. So let's say when the drought came in 18, for example, were we able to get at the good quality silage, you know, things like that, and simple things just to bear in mind. And then with the higher grazing platform stocking rate, you need to build your covers earlier. You're going to peak out earlier. Basically, as I would say, more or less let the thing run on from June and don't worry too much about it. Just don't take out silage unless things get really. And really, if you take it over the 3 years of the experiment, we were more likely always running into deficits rather than surpluses. Surpluses weren't an issue really from the end of May onwards. So, not even to react too quickly in terms of going in feeding silage. Just let it run until things start to run down. You know, once you start below 150 per cow, you maybe need to react. So, summary and conclusions. During the study, we had 2 wet springs and 1 dry summer in 17 and 18. We also had a wet spring in 19, but because of the carryover from 18, it didn't have any real impact. We did have a wet autumn in 19, which didn't impact us too badly until we got right to the end of the year. When ground conditions got very wet in November. On the control system, 2.5 cows per hectare, we got an average of 243 grazing days per cow compared to typical 255, which was weather related for the most part. And you have to bear these results in mind in interpreting these results and even the economic analysis. But I'd much prefer to have less favorable set of data to work with. Gives you more, you can have more confidence in your results. We look at the difference between in terms of what you recommend to people. 39 days difference in grazing days per cow, going from the 2.5 up to 4 on the grazing platform. So we're losing 13 days for every half a cow increase per hectare. No difference in milk output per cow. Again, as I said, that was surprising, seeing as a lot of silage going in on the higher stocking rates. But I think when there was high quality silage being made, supplemented with grass often, as I said, we might have cows on silage 3 days a week and out grazing 4 days a week. So we worked it that way and seemed to work out fine. All things being equal, difference in feed costs were around 16%, including the cost of additional cost of bringing in silage from outblocks and exporting slurry back out onto the outblocks. and then we say most of the scenarios we looked at, and of course everybody would have, people are going to come at this from different perspectives. A farmer in his mid-50 might look at this a lot differently to a farmer in his mid-30s, what kind of drawings they have and whatever else. But increasing stocking rate is feasible when you take all of the, you take net worth into account, or the increase in value of the unit. So we'd be happy enough to recommend the stock rate of going to 4 cows per hectare. We manage that fine under the conditions we had in Silage, of course, which is good grass growing farm, and of course that's something that also has to be borne in mind. With the overall farm stocking rate of 2.5 cows per hectare. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it.
Okay, James, that's very good. Thanks very much. So I suppose there's one question there that I'll put in a second, but just from my own point of view, what was the rationale for feeding the silage on a day a week? Is it just trying to simplify the process?
It's down to like if you cows half full up with silage, suppose you put them in at night and they have a belly full of silage going out in the morning, and they're out grazing grass, and then they're going back in on silage. You know, when you're switching between the two, and I'll attribute this purely to Donald Patton, and we would have been operating what I'm talking about earlier, putting them in at night. That's what we would have done previously. We're putting them in for 24 hours, eat the silage out, they finish the silage 4 o'clock in the morning, so they're going out hungry the next day, and they'll graze out. And really it was to achieve better graze outs, better clean outs.
Okay.
And I think on balance, we found it to be a good system, and we recommend that. And as I said, then if we're feeding silage, if say we could have one herd there on silage 1 day a week, we could have had another herd on silage 3 days a week. We wouldn't be 3 days on and 3 days and 4 days off. It was graze grass 1 day, silage next, graze grass, silage. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So we're trying to keep graze grass in the diet.
Okay. Just then as well, did you count the zero grazing as days at grass when in the count of days grazing, or was that separate? Because it's coming off the outblock, like.
There was very little zero grazing done.
Okay.
And I think Frederica could answer that question better than me.
Yeah, that was counted separate. It was counted as grazed grass in the diet, but not as a grazing day.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we've a couple of questions there. So first one that came in is in relation to the 4-cut silage system. So what's the fertilizer regime for that, which is a good point, feeds into silage quality a lot?
Oh, I can't remember that offhand, but it's essentially, we stocked at 2.5 cows per hectare. During the study, we used 280 kilos of nitrogen fertilizer, and I think off the top of my head it was around 70 kilos per application, per cut, with more slurry going in for the earlier cuts, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And we would use a compound fertilizer across the board. In the earlier years, using just standard 29015 type fertilizer. Now, in recent years, we've been using protected urea and the similar compound.
Okay, so, and Grania Hurley's asking, is there a cost for leased land, or is it assumed as owned?
Assumed as owned.
Assumed as owned, okay.
Yeah.
And how would you see the influence of changing that to a leased regime on the overall bottom line, I suppose?
Frederica, did you put in an opportunity cost for the land in the...
No, we assumed it to be all owned land, and so the way we calculated it to keep it across the board on all the systems is that any surplus silage was sold, and so any land that was not used to the full potential, the silage was just sold, and if there was a deficit, then silage was bought in. So and we calculated it with a cost that is kind of similar-ish to the cost that I found for leasing out the land. So it would be comparable to leasing out the land, but of course that then depends on the herbage yields on those land blocks as well. So I calculated with the fixed herbage yields we got from the trial.
Okay.
Yeah, so I suppose there would be an additional lease cost in that case.
Okay, so Mark Tracy is wondering, can the figures be done taking account of cost of leasing the land in, potentially?
Yeah, we can. We can.
Okay, so and another question from Mark is, normally when you increase above 3 cows per hectare on the milking platform, composition of the milk suffers at the shoulders, but you didn't find that, is it?
No.
Okay, so but that's purely driven by the silage quality, James, in your opinion, or just?
Like I don't know. Like if you look at previous work, even work we've done ourselves, like when you're going in with silage, you normally get a drop in production. You get a drop in protein. In this particular study, over 3 years, where we're making high quality, high dry matter silage, we were getting no loss in production, and that was consistent over the 3 years. And I suppose that's the lesson we learned, that you need to make high quality silage. You need to be targeting high quality silage, and you could ask questions then about the cost of making silage. And if you look at the cost of making silage relative to the feeding value of the silage, there's no downside to it. You need to make higher quality silage. I think it's something that we certainly have, but I'd say even across the board that there hasn't been maybe enough attention given it to it in recent years.
Yeah, definitely, I'd agree with you. Something I've been advocating a long time, and so has Joe Patton with the last number of years in particular. I suppose as the stocking rate has increased and the emphasis has been put onto silage, but it's an astounding figure, I suppose, coming back from your study there, that you're looking at 40 to 55%, even 60% silage going into the lactation diet. It would never have been thought to be in the case. Just the is it bales or pit then that you're doing all the time, or is it a combination of both?
In our case, it's all bales, and that's because we failed the nitrate inspection, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago now, and we were obliged to make bales. And we actually found, from the point of view of running these trials and feeding out different types of silage at different times into different herds, making bales suits us a lot better. Our costs then are taken in on that basis, which again would make our silage relatively more expensive than if we were making pit silage. So we've ramped up our costs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay. So
our silage is relatively expensive.
The costs of yours in the study are reflecting that increased costs of contracting as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm kind of content enough to do that, because we'd sooner overestimate the costs and have a safe conclusion rather than underestimating them. And I think our costs are pretty much in line with what you'd see and say the profit monitor and everything else. So we're not gone off the wall, but we're certainly not underestimating the cost. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It's a true reflection of what's happening on the ground potentially. So it's a good test of the system.
Yeah.
Okay, Martina, you're going to come in there.
So James, just a question here in relation to post-grazing heights. So was there any issue with the higher stocking rate trial in terms of achieving the target post-grazing, particularly from the point of view that you're not taking out surplus bales or have opportunities probably to reseed ground either?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that we were concerned about. We didn't find that wasn't an issue at all. That didn't come up. No difference in post-grazing height. Yeah, no issue there. Good cleanouts, no problem. Like I'd even wonder about you probably do have some opportunity for reseeding on the platform at that stocking rate. It would be very tight. Like we did harvest silage off the platform in every year during the month of May.
Okay. And then the other question, James, in terms of, so it was 125 cows that you used for this trial. Do you think the findings are applicable to a bigger herd? So say for somebody going from 125 cows maybe to 160, 180 cows or more?
Yeah, well, look, our systems, we had only 25 cows or 24 cows per system. So I think when if you take the increasing scenario, the fact that the labour is costed in, the expansion costs are costed in, it shouldn't make a difference. If you're going from 75 to 100 cows, or if you're going from 150 to 180 cows, it shouldn't make a difference in terms of interpretation of the results. It's fully costed.
Okay. And then James, just back, and I know you talked about it a minute ago with Stuart, but just another question has come in relation to building of the autumn covers. So I suppose the debate that happens at times is, you know, to go down the option that you did with the trial, or else perhaps maybe not to go in with silage earlier on in August to build covers, and then house the cows earlier on. We'll say, look, early October, start to put them in maybe at night. Did you think of that option?
Well, okay, so we didn't use silage as such to build covers. Like covers built, like you'll normally gain during July and August, and then you start running into a decline as demand is exceeding supply, and really we use silage as a break more than to build, if you know what I mean. To slow down the rate at which we go in. We thought about that. We thought about it in the context of you could graze out. The risk with that, of course, then is that you go in and you're left with a lot of grass. If you get a particularly good back end, which we did in 19, you could be left with an awful lot of grass on the farm going into the winter. And like, I know the recommendations for closing up have increased 600, 800, maybe even 1,000 now. Some people are saying it's a lot of grass to leave on the ground, particularly if you're up at the higher end of that scale. So that was something that we were conscious of. We wanted to more or less finish up all the herds at more or less the same closing cover. Didn't actually work out like that. Generally, we had a higher closing cover and a higher stocking rate, because eventually we just said we'll just go in. We'd end up maybe going 2 or 3 weeks earlier and have a higher cover over the winter as a consequence, higher turnout covered in the following spring. And you could see there was some merit in that we were feeding silage to cows in late lactation, which makes sense, and getting cows out earlier to grass in the spring when they're going, they'd respond better to it. So that's kind of how it worked out. But we didn't want to have big differences between the herds in that regard, if you know what I mean. We didn't want to have one kind of management scenario and the other herd on a different type of management. We want to keep them fairly similar.
Okay, and then the other question, James, is in relation to the silage, and I suppose the amount of high quality silage that you required, particularly for the higher stocking rate group. Did you run into any issues with high K in the silage?
Well, we did, particularly in 17, that winter. I'm just trying to remember. It was partly a consequence of harvesting fairly immature silage, and we had a problem as well with trichose supplementation. So the cows weren't getting enough magnesium in that first year. But if you take the last 2 years, 18, 19, even this year, we've the problem solved. And as I said, it's down to mineral supplementation, and it's also down to when you analyze the silage, we want a high dry matter silage or the high DMD silage for lactation, poor quality silage. For tricow feed, we also get it tested for potassium, and we feed the silage accordingly. So high K silages, we keep that away from the tricows.
Okay, thanks, James. Okay, so just there's probably a small bit of an overemphasis on the zero grazing here now, considering you didn't do a huge amount of it, but would you consider the zero graze grass the same as taking a cut of bales if your facilities were allowing? So I suppose maybe, I think, and you can come back here, Dan, maybe Dan Crowley's asking the question, that he's possibly talking about that September cut maybe, or as an option for if you couldn't cut the bale or cut the grass as silage potentially.
Yeah, so I think our starting point was like the zero graze grass, there's a cost with it. It may be marginally cheaper than silage, but that's what you'd say. It's marginal at best. Again, in terms of the message going out, we wanted to make silage, feed silage back in. That's what we did. As I said, we had this problem about how to manage things in the autumn, particularly when ground conditions get very wet. Silage making conditions could be very difficult. I think the zero grazer has a role in that. Say late September through to December, we were still growing a lot of grass on the outblocks, and as I said, it rotted in the first year. That wasn't something that we wanted to do. I think the zero grazer has a role in under those circumstances, and even like it was last year, really 19, the end of 19, we were using it, going in under very wet conditions, not doing a lot of damage. Where the tractor wasn't turning much, if you longer, if you're doing a lot of turning with a zero grazer, you're doing some damage. But other than that, we were very pleased with it. We certainly use it again. And yeah, under those circumstances. Okay. I don't know if that's answering your question, but like at the back end, I'd say zero graze grass, making silage. Making silage is risky. Maybe zero grazing is the way to go.
Yeah, okay. So we need to wrap it up now. So just the final question, I suppose, coming back to your emphasis on the silage quality aspect again, how many bales of high quality silage was required per cow as you moved up the stocking rates, to the higher stocking rates?
Oh my God. So we have it in kilos of dry matter. So yeah. We went from 7 tons of settled silage to 10 tons. And what's 800 kilos per bale?
We generally say 200 kilos to the bale, 200 kilos of dry matter.
Of dry matter.
Yeah, approximately.
So 1.4, that's 7 bales going to 2, which is 10 bales on a dry matter basis.
Yeah. Okay, so we've come to 10:30 there, so we have to finish up. So thanks very much to James and Frederica for joining us today, and thank you to yourselves for joining in as well. And just to remind you that the next seminar is on the 15th of July, where Mike Egan will be talking about the closing and opening cover trials that he has done in the past number of years. So thanks again to James and Frederica, and wish you all the best, and take care in the meantime.